April 27, 1945, the Apennine Mountains of northern Italy. At an elevation of nearly 1,500 meters above sea level, where the morning air still carried the sharp bite of lingering winter, Private First Class Isaiah Munro stood at the edge of a makeshift aid station. His Bible, a King James version with a black leather cover worn smooth by decades of devoted handling, rested tucked into his medic's satchel beside neatly rolled bandages, packets of sulfanilamide powder to prevent infection, morphine syrettes for pain management, and tourniquets that he prayed he would not need to use. The morning sun had just begun to paint the eastern peaks in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain that had become as familiar to him as the red clay roads of rural Georgia, where he had grown up. Around him, members of the 92nd Infantry Division, the famed Buffalo Soldiers, whose legacy stretched back through generations of American conflicts, prepared their equipment for what intelligence officers assured them would be a routine reconnaissance patrol through the Gothic Line's rapidly crumbling defenses. The massive German defensive system that had once seemed impregnable, stretching across the northern Apennines from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic coast, was collapsing under the weight of the Allied spring offensive. The war in Europe was winding down, everyone said with growing confidence. The German forces in Italy, once a formidable fighting force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were retreating northward in increasingly disorganized columns. This patrol would be simple, straightforward, perhaps even boring, a final formality before the inevitable German surrender that every soldier knew was coming within days or weeks at most. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew, as they checked their weapons and adjusted their equipment in the thin mountain air, was that Private Munro's deeply personal choice to carry a worn leather Bible, instead of the standard-issue rifle he was legally entitled to refuse, would become the single factor that determined whether 12 American soldiers lived to see their families again, or died in a forgotten mountain village in the final desperate hours of a war that was already ending. Isaiah Munro had arrived on Italian soil in February of 1944 as part of the Buffalo Soldiers, the segregated military units that had fought with courage and distinction since the days following the American Civil War, when formerly enslaved men first donned the uniform of the United States Army. The 92nd Infantry Division, composed entirely of black enlisted men serving under predominantly white officers, a structure that reflected the deep racial divisions still defining American society, even as it fought against totalitarian oppression abroad, had been assigned some of the most punishingly difficult terrain in the entire Italian campaign, the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Apennines, where a single misstep could send a man tumbling hundreds of meters down rocky slopes. The heavily fortified German defensive positions carved into mountainsides, designed by military engineers who understood how to transform natural geography into lethal advantage. The brutal winter conditions that turned fingers numb, made weapons malfunction, and killed men through exposure as surely as any bullet. These were the circumstances that shaped Munro's first months of combat, testing not just his body, but his faith in ways he had never imagined during his peaceful childhood in Georgia. But Isaiah Munro was fundamentally different from most soldiers in one critical, deeply personal way. He was a conscientious objector who had voluntarily chosen to serve as a combat medic rather than avoid military service entirely. Born in the small farming community of Milledgeville, Georgia, in 1922, Munro had grown up surrounded by the rhythms of rural Southern life and immersed in a deeply religious family where faith was not merely Sunday observance, but the foundation of daily existence. His father, Reverend Samuel Munro, was a Baptist preacher, known throughout the county for sermons that could make hardened men weep, and for a compassion that extended to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, a radical position in the segregated South of the 1920s and 30s. His mother, Elizabeth Munro, taught at the colored school, patiently educating children in a one-room building with textbooks discarded by the white schools, determined that her students would have every opportunity she could provide, despite the systematic oppression designed to limit their futures. From his earliest childhood memories, Isaiah had been taught that all human life was sacred in the eyes of God. That violence against another person, regardless of the justification, regardless of the provocation, was a sin against God himself. His father would read from the Sermon on the Mount, emphasizing Christ's words. "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Young Isaiah absorbed these teachings completely, making them the core of his identity in ways that would define every major decision of his life. When the Selective Service Notice arrived at the Monroe family home in the summer of 1943, that official government document that commanded young Isaiah to report for induction into the United States Army, he faced a choice that thousands of young men of faith confronted during those years of total war. He could compromise the religious beliefs that had shaped his entire existence, pick up a weapon, and potentially take human life in service to his country, or he could refuse military service entirely, claiming conscientious objector status and facing the social stigma, legal consequences, and accusations of cowardice that often accompanied such decisions. Or he could find a third path, a way to serve his country that honored both his patriotic duty and his deepest spiritual convictions. He chose the Medical Corps, that branch of military service that saved lives rather than taking them. The United States Army, recognizing both legal requirements and practical necessities, allowed conscientious objectors to serve in non-combatant roles, positions where they could contribute to the war effort without directly participating in violence. For men like Isaiah Monroe, who could not in good conscience carry a weapon but felt a duty to serve alongside their fellow citizens, the Medical Corps offered a path forward that satisfied both their spiritual convictions and their sense of national obligation. But this was a decision that often brought suspicion, contempt, and outright hostility from fellow soldiers who could not understand or refused to try to understand why any able-bodied man would voluntarily refuse to carry a weapon. In training camps scattered across the United States, from Fort Benning in Georgia to Camp Robinson in Arkansas, medics who refused to bear arms were sometimes openly called cowards by other trainees. They faced constant questions and challenges about their masculinity, their patriotism, their courage. They were excluded from the informal bonds of camaraderie that naturally formed among men who would fight together, viewed with a mixture of pity and disdain by those who believed that real soldiers carried weapons and dealt death to their enemies. For Isaiah Monroe, a black man serving in a military that remained rigidly segregated, despite fighting a war against an enemy whose racial ideology made American segregation seem almost moderate by comparison, the judgment was even harsher and more complex. Black soldiers in the 1940s already carried the burden of representing their entire race in a society that questioned whether African Americans possessed the same courage, intelligence, and capability as white Americans. Military leaders openly debated whether black soldiers could fight effectively in combat. Racist pseudoscientific theories about racial differences in bravery and aggression were discussed seriously by officers and policymakers. Every black soldier knew that he was being watched, evaluated, judged not just as an individual, but as a representative of millions of African Americans whose full citizenship and equality remained contested. For Monroe to then add the additional burden of refusing to carry a weapon, to voluntarily accept a role that many white and black soldiers alike viewed as less courageous than direct combat, meant accepting a double stigma. He was a black soldier in a white-dominated military, and a conscientious objector in a culture that valued martial prowess above almost all other virtues. Some of his fellow black soldiers viewed his choice with respect, seeing it as a principled stand that took its own kind of courage. Others saw it as a betrayal, another example that would be used by racists to argue that black men lacked the warrior spirit necessary for combat. Through all of this, Isaiah Monroe held firm to his convictions with a quiet determination that gradually earned respect even from those who disagreed with his choices. During medical training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, he proved to be one of the most dedicated students in his class, memorizing anatomy, mastering emergency procedures, learning to work quickly and efficiently under pressure. His instructors noted that Monro approached medical training with the same devotion that other soldiers brought to weapons training, as if his ability to save lives carried the same weight of responsibility as another man's ability to take them. The Bible he carried everywhere had belonged to his father before him, and to his grandfather before that. It was a King James Version, published in 1903 by the Oxford University Press, its black leather cover worn soft and supple by decades of daily handling, its pages marked and annotated by 3 generations of Monro men. Inside the front cover, his father had written in the careful, deliberate script of a man who understood the power of words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." These words from the 23rd Psalm had been read at weddings and funerals, whispered during moments of crisis, memorized by Isaiah before he could fully understand their meaning. Isaiah had read those particular words countless times during his months of service in the Italian mountains, during the frozen nights spent in foxholes scraped into rocky soil, when the temperature dropped below freezing and men huddled together for warmth while German artillery screamed overhead, during the chaotic aftermath of artillery barrages, when wounded men cried out in pain and fear, and Monro moved among them with steady hands and quiet prayers, doing what he could to ease their suffering, even when he knew some wounds were beyond any medic's ability to heal. During the moments when he held dying soldiers in his arms, feeling the life drain out of them despite his best efforts, experiencing a profound sense of powerlessness that no training could prepare him for. In those moments, the words of the psalm reminded him that even in the darkest valleys, even when death seemed to surround him on all sides, he was not alone. By late April of 1945, the mood in the 92nd Division was cautiously optimistic. The Allied spring offensive had broken through the Gothic line. German forces throughout northern Italy were in retreat. Intelligence reports suggested that organized resistance would soon collapse entirely. The war in Europe would be over within weeks, perhaps days. Soldiers who had survived years of combat began to believe they might actually make it home alive. On that April morning, Sergeant James Colbert assembled a 12-man patrol for a reconnaissance mission into the mountains north of their current position. Colbert was a career soldier from Detroit, a man who had enlisted before the war and worked his way up through the ranks, despite the barriers that limited black advancement in the military. He was respected by his men, known for his tactical sense and for keeping his squad alive through some of the division's bloodiest engagements. The patrol included a mix of veterans and newer replacements. There was Corporal William "Billy" Hayes from Philadelphia, a former steelworker who had survived the Winter Campaign. Private Robert Chen, whose Chinese-American family had been turned away from white units and ended up assigned to the 92nd. Private Thomas Wright, barely 19 years old, who had arrived as a replacement just 3 weeks earlier after the division's casualties in the spring offensive. Private Leon Jackson from Alabama, who carried a harmonica and played blues songs during quiet moments. Corporal Eugene Foster, a former schoolteacher from Chicago. Private Samuel Davis, who received letters from his wife every week without fail. And 6 others, each with their own stories, their own reasons for being in these mountains so far from home. And there was Private First Class Isaiah Monro, the medic who carried a Bible instead of a rifle. Sergeant Colbert had initially been skeptical of Monro when he joined the unit. A soldier who refused to carry a weapon seemed like a liability, someone who would need protection rather than providing it. But over months of combat, Colbert's opinion had shifted. He had seen Monro run through machine gun fire to reach wounded men. He had watched Monro work for hours in a freezing aid station, treating dozens of casualties with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. He had heard men say that if you were hit, you prayed Monro would be the one to reach you first, because Isaiah Monro would not leave you behind, no matter what. Still, there was something about Monro that made the other soldiers uncomfortable. It was not just the refusal to carry a weapon. It was the way Monro would read his Bible during breaks, moving his lips silently as he turned the pages. It was the way he would pray over wounded men, regardless of whether they wanted it or not. It was the absolute certainty in his faith, the unshakable belief that God would protect him, that seemed almost arrogant to men who had seen friends torn apart by artillery, who knew that survival was more about luck than divine intervention. The patrol left the company position just after dawn. The objective was straightforward: advance 3 kilometers north along a mountain trail, observe German positions in the valley beyond, and return with intelligence about enemy movements. Intelligence officers believed the German forces in this sector were limited to rearguard units, small groups tasked with delaying the Allied advance, while the main forces retreated toward the Po River Valley. The patrol expected to encounter little resistance. They moved through terrain that was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The Apennines in late April were emerging from winter, with wildflowers blooming among the rocks, streams swollen with snowmelt cascading down the mountainsides. But the trails were narrow, the slopes steep, and the elevation meant that morning temperatures still hovered near freezing. The men walked in tactical spacing, weapons ready, but the atmosphere was almost relaxed. This felt like a formality, a box to check before the inevitable German surrender. Isaiah Munro walked in the middle of the patrol column, his position as medic keeping him away from the most exposed positions at the front and rear. His satchel contained enough supplies to treat multiple casualties: morphine syrettes, bandages, sulfanilamide powder to prevent infection, tourniquets, plasma for shock, and tucked into a specially sewn pocket on the side of the satchel, his father's Bible. He had read from it that morning before the patrol departed, finding comfort in the Psalms. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." They reached the observation point after 2 hours of climbing. From a rocky outcrop, they could see into the valley below, where a narrow road wound between the mountains. Sergeant Colbert used his binoculars to scan for signs of German activity. He saw nothing: no vehicles, no soldiers, no defensive positions. The valley appeared abandoned. Then Thomas Wright, the youngest member of the patrol, said quietly, "Sergeant, I see something." Colbert moved to Wright's position. The private was pointing toward a cluster of buildings about 500 meters down the slope, partially hidden by trees. It looked like a small mountain village, the kind of place that had probably been home to shepherds and farmers before the war turned this entire region into a battlefield. Through the binoculars, Colbert could make out more details. The buildings were stone structures with tile roofs, built in the traditional style of the Italian mountains. He saw no signs of military activity, no German vehicles or equipment. But something felt wrong. The village was too quiet, too still. "Could be abandoned," Billy Hayes said. "Civilians probably cleared out months ago." "Or it could be an observation post," Eugene Foster suggested. "Good position to watch the valley." Colbert considered the options. Their orders were to observe and report, not to investigate potential enemy positions. The safe decision would be to note the village's location and return to company headquarters with the information. But intelligence had been insistent that they needed detailed reconnaissance of this sector. And if the village was occupied by German forces, that was exactly the kind of information the division needed. "We will check it out," Colbert decided. "Slow approach, weapons ready. Munro, stay close to the center of the formation." They began moving down the slope toward the village, spread out in a tactical formation that would allow them to respond quickly if fired upon. The descent was difficult, requiring them to navigate loose rocks and steep inclines. Every soldier was acutely aware that if someone started shooting from the village, they would be exposed on this open slope with limited cover. But no shots came. They reached the edge of the village without incident. Up close, the buildings showed signs of abandonment: broken windows, doors hanging open, household items scattered in the streets. It looked like the residents had left in a hurry, probably fleeing ahead of the fighting that had swept through this region. Sergeant Colbert divided the patrol into 3 teams to search the buildings. "Check every structure," he ordered. "Watch for booby traps, stay in pairs." Isaiah Munro moved through the village with Corporal Foster, checking buildings that had been cleared by the lead teams. They found evidence of recent German occupation: empty ration tins with German labels, cigarette butts, a discarded helmet with a camouflage cover. But the German forces had clearly pulled out, probably in the last day or two. They were searching the largest building, what had once been a village meeting house or church, when Munro noticed something that made him stop. In the corner of the main room, someone had carved words into the wooden wall. The letters were rough, scratched with a knife or bayonet, but the message was clear in German. Gott mit uns. God with us. Monroe stared at those words, feeling a strange connection across the divide of war. Some German soldier had stood in this room, probably recently, and had carved a prayer into the wall. That soldier believed God was with him, just as Monroe believed God was with him. Both of them were asking the same God for protection, for survival, for the war to end. What did God think, Monroe wondered, when both sides of a war prayed for victory? "Monroe, let's move," Foster said from the doorway. "Sergeant wants to regroup." They gathered in the village square. Colbert was preparing to order the patrol to return to their lines when Private Leon Jackson, who had been checking the buildings on the northern edge of the village, came running back with urgent news. "Sergeant, you need to see this," Jackson said, breathing hard. "There's a German position dug in about 200 meters north of here. Looks abandoned, but there is equipment left behind." Colbert and several others followed Jackson to investigate. What they found was a hastily abandoned defensive position, a network of foxholes and trenches overlooking the northern approach to the village. There were empty ammunition boxes, several boxes of German stick grenades, and most significantly, a heavy machine gun still mounted on its tripod, pointing down the mountain trail. "Why would they leave the gun?" Billy Hayes asked. "That is not standard procedure for a retreat." Eugene Foster knelt to examine the machine gun more closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the weapon's feed mechanism. "It is jammed, must have malfunctioned, and they did not have time to fix it or remove it." Colbert was about to respond when the sound of engines echoed up from the valley below. Every man in the patrol immediately dropped into cover positions, weapons aimed toward the sound. Through gaps in the trees, they could see movement on the valley road, German vehicles, at least 6 or 7 of them, moving north in a convoy. "That is a lot more than a rear guard," Thomas Wright whispered. Colbert watched through his binoculars as the convoy passed. He counted 3 troop trucks, 2 smaller vehicles that looked like staff cars, and 2 armored half-tracks. This was not the scattered remnants of a defeated army. This was an organized unit on the move, probably trying to reach German lines before the Allied advance cut them off. "We need to report this immediately," Colbert said. "Pack up. We are heading back." They were preparing to leave when the situation changed in an instant. From somewhere on the mountainside above them, a single rifle shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the stone wall near where Corporal Foster was standing, sending rock fragments flying. Foster dropped to the ground and the entire patrol scattered for cover. "Contact! North side!" someone shouted. More shots followed, the distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles echoing off the mountainsides. The patrol returned fire, but they could not see their attackers. The shots were coming from elevated positions in the rocks and trees above the village, and the German soldiers, however many there were, had excellent cover. Sergeant Colbert tried to assess the situation. They were pinned down in the village, taking fire from an unknown number of enemy soldiers in superior positions. His radio operator, Private Davis, was trying to raise company headquarters on the portable radio, but the mountains interfered with the signal. They were on their own. "Monroe!" Colbert shouted. "Anyone hit?" Isaiah Monroe was pressed against the wall of a stone building, his heart pounding. He had been in combat before, but the sudden violence of an ambush never got easier. He checked the men nearest to him. Everyone appeared uninjured so far. "We are good here," Monroe called back. The firefight continued for several minutes, the American soldiers returning fire at muzzle flashes and movement in the rocks above. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the German fire stopped. The silence was almost more unnerving than the shooting had been. "Hold fire," Colbert ordered. "Conserve ammunition. Davis, what is the status on that radio?" "Still cannot get through, Sergeant," Davis replied. "The mountains are blocking the signal." Then they heard a voice calling from above, speaking English with a heavy German accent. "American soldiers. You are surrounded. Put down your weapons and you will not be harmed." Colbert and his men exchanged glances. A demand for surrender was not what they had expected. If the German forces truly had them surrounded and outnumbered, why had they stopped shooting? "How many do you think there are?" Billy Hayes whispered to Colbert. "Not sure," Colbert replied quietly. Could be a dozen. Could be more. But if they really had us pinned, they would have kept firing. The German voice called out again. We know you are American 92nd Division. You are cut off. The valley is blocked. Surrender now. Isaiah Munro listened to these exchanges with a growing sense of dread. He had heard stories about American prisoners of war, especially black soldiers. The German forces had different units with different attitudes toward captured enemies, but there were reports of atrocities, of soldiers who surrendered and were never seen again. And there were specific fears among black soldiers that they would be treated worse than white prisoners, that the racial ideology of the German regime would extend to how they handled captured African-American troops. Sergeant Colbert made a decision. We are not surrendering, he said firmly. We will hold this position until dark, then move out. Davis, keep trying that radio. Everyone else, watch your ammunition. Prepare for a long afternoon. The hours that followed were a study in psychological warfare. The German soldiers did not renew their attack, but they made their presence known through periodic bursts of rifle fire that prevented the American patrol from moving. The Americans could not advance or retreat without exposing themselves to fire from the high ground. They were trapped in the village, and everyone knew that their situation would only get worse as daylight faded, and the German forces, wherever they were, could potentially maneuver under cover of darkness. Isaiah Munro spent those hours moving between the scattered patrol members, checking on their physical and mental condition. He found Private Thomas Wright shaking, not from cold, but from fear. This was Wright's first real combat situation, and the young soldier was struggling to control his panic. I should not be here, Wright said, his voice barely above a whisper. I am going to die here. I know it. Munro sat down beside him in the shelter of a stone wall. You are not going to die, Munro said with conviction. Do you believe in God, Thomas? I do not know, Wright said. Maybe. My mama does. Well, I believe, Munro said, pulling his Bible from his satchel. And I believe that God has a plan for each of us. You are here for a reason, and it is not to die in this village. You are going home to see your mama again. He opened the Bible to a passage he had marked from the book of Isaiah. It says here, Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Do you understand what that means, Thomas? That God will help us? Wright asked. It means that even in the darkest moments, even when we are surrounded and scared and do not know if we will see tomorrow, God is there, Munro said. And if God is there, then we have hope. Always. Wright seemed to steady slightly, drawing comfort from Munro's absolute certainty. Across the patrol, other men noticed Munro's calm presence, the way he moved without panic, the way he spoke with confidence about survival when every tactical assessment suggested they were in serious trouble. As afternoon moved toward evening, Sergeant Colbert gathered his key personnel to discuss options. We have maybe 3 hours until dark, he said. The radio is still dead, so no one knows we are in trouble. We cannot stay here. If those German forces bring up reinforcements or heavy weapons, we are finished. We need to move. What about their claim that the valley is blocked? Eugene Foster asked. Could be a bluff, Billy Hayes suggested. We only saw one convoy. Maybe they are trying to scare us into surrendering. Or maybe they have more forces than we know, Leon Jackson countered. Maybe we are walking into a bigger mess if we try to move. Colbert turned to Isaiah Munro, who had been listening quietly. Munro, you have been walking around talking to everyone. What is the mood? Can these men move if we make a run for it? Munro considered the question carefully. They are scared, he said honestly. Some more than others. But they will follow your orders, Sergeant. They trust you. What about you? Colbert asked. You scared? Yes, Munro admitted. But I have faith that we will make it through this. I have been praying, and I believe God is telling me that this is not our time to die. Colbert looked at Munro for a long moment. The sergeant was not a particularly religious man. He had seen too much in this war to maintain simple faith. But there was something about Munro's conviction that was almost contagious. If nothing else, having someone in the patrol who genuinely believed they would survive might keep the others from losing hope entirely. All right, Colbert said. Here is the plan. We wait until near dark, then we move fast back the way we came. Stay spread out, stay low, and if we take fire, we do not stop to fight. We break contact and run. Our survival depends on speed, not firepower. Understood. The patrol members nodded their agreement. They spent the remaining daylight preparing for the movement, checking weapons, redistributing ammunition, mentally preparing for what could be a deadly sprint through enemy territory. Isaiah Munro used the time to pray. He sat with his back against a stone wall, his Bible open on his lap, and he read passages that had sustained him through every trial of this war. He prayed for each man in the patrol by name, asking God to protect them, to guide their steps, to bring them safely home. And he prayed for guidance, asking God to show him what he was meant to do, how he was meant to help these men survive. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold, Sergeant Colbert gave the order to prepare to move. The plan was to leave in 3 groups, spaced 2 minutes apart, moving quickly back toward their own lines. If they could reach the trail they had used that morning, they would have a chance of making it to safety. The first group, led by Billy Hayes, slipped out of the village just as darkness was beginning to fall. They made it perhaps 50 meters before German machine gun fire erupted from the hillside. The Americans dove for cover as bullets tore through the trees and kicked up dirt around them. Hayes shouted for his team to fall back, and they scrambled back toward the village under covering fire from the rest of the patrol. "They are dug in all along that route," Hayes reported breathlessly when he reached safety. "We cannot go that way." Colbert cursed under his breath. The Germans had anticipated their escape route and positioned themselves to block it. They were truly trapped now, with no clear way out and darkness falling fast. "What do we do, Sergeant?" Eugene Foster asked. Before Colbert could answer, they heard vehicles approaching from the valley, the sound of engines and the rattle of tracked vehicles moving uphill toward the village. Through the growing darkness they could see lights approaching, at least 3 or 4 vehicles climbing the mountain road. "They are bringing up reinforcements," Leon Jackson said, stating what everyone was thinking. "They are going to surround us completely." The situation had gone from difficult to desperate. The American patrol was outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded in a village with no clear escape route, and about to be overrun by German forces with vehicles and heavy weapons. Every man in the patrol understood that capture or death were becoming the only likely outcomes. Thomas Wright started to shake again, his rifle trembling in his hands. "We are all going to die," he said. "We are all going to die here." Isaiah Munro heard the young soldier's despair, and something inside him shifted. He had been afraid too, had been wondering if this would be the day his faith was tested beyond its limits. But hearing Wright's words, seeing the fear spreading through the entire patrol, Munro felt a strange calm settle over him. This was the moment. This was what he was meant to do. "No," Munro said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "No one is dying today." Sergeant Colbert turned to look at the medic. "Munro, I appreciate the sentiment, but I am going out there," Munro interrupted. "I am going to talk to them." "What? That is insane," Billy Hayes said. "They will shoot you the moment you step out of cover." "No, they will not," Munro said with absolute conviction. He was already standing, slinging his medical satchel across his shoulder. "They are professional soldiers. They will not shoot an unarmed medic who is trying to negotiate." "You do not know that," Colbert said. "Munro, I cannot let you—" "With respect, Sergeant, you cannot stop me," Munro said. "I am going. God will protect me." He pulled his Bible from the satchel and held it in his left hand. With his right hand he pulled out a white bandage and tied it to a stick, creating an improvised flag of truce. Before anyone could physically restrain him, Isaiah Munro stepped out from behind cover and began walking toward the German positions on the hillside. "Munro, get back here," Colbert hissed urgently, but Munro kept walking. The American soldiers watched in stunned disbelief as their medic walked calmly up the mountain slope, his white flag held high, his Bible clutched in his other hand. He made no attempt to take cover, showed no sign of fear. He walked as if he were strolling through a peaceful field, not crossing a battlefield where any moment a bullet could end his life. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice called out in German from the rocks above. Munro could not understand the words, but he kept walking. The voice called out again, more urgently. Monroe stopped walking but remained standing, fully exposed. "I am a medic," Monroe called out in English. "I am unarmed. I want to speak with your commanding officer." There was a long silence. The American patrol held their breath, expecting to hear the shot that would cut Monroe down. The vehicles from the valley were getting closer, their engines growing louder. Everything seemed to hang in that moment, balanced on a knife's edge between violence and something else. Then a figure emerged from the rocks above. It was a German soldier, an officer based on his uniform, holding a rifle but with the barrel pointed down. He called out something in German, and several more soldiers appeared, their weapons also lowered but ready. The German officer approached Monroe cautiously. He was a man in his 40s, Monroe estimated, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years in combat. His uniform was worn and patched, but his bearing was that of a professional soldier. "You speak German?" the officer asked in accented but clear English. "No, sir," Monroe replied. "Only English." The officer studied Monroe for a moment, taking in the medical insignia on his uniform, the satchel, the Bible he held. "Why do you come here? Your men are surrounded. They should surrender." "My men will not surrender," Monroe said firmly. "They would rather die fighting than become prisoners, but there does not need to be more dying today. The war is almost over. Everyone knows Germany cannot win now. Why should more men die for a war that is already lost?" The German officer's expression hardened. "You know nothing about—" "I know that you carved Gott mit uns into the wall down in that village," Monroe interrupted, holding up his Bible. "God with us, that is what this says too. We both believe God is with us. We both believe we are fighting for something important. But God does not want this, sir. God does not want us killing each other in these mountains when the fighting could stop." The officer stared at Monroe for a long moment. Behind him, the other German soldiers were listening, some looking uncomfortable. Finally, the officer said, "I am Hauptmann Weber. I command these men. We are rear guard for our division, tasked with delaying your advance. It is our duty." "I understand duty," Monroe said, "but I also understand mercy. Captain Weber, you have us surrounded. You could kill us all. But what would that accomplish? The war will be over in days or weeks. Those men down there have families waiting for them. I am sure your men do too. Let us leave, and no one has to die today." Weber shook his head. "I cannot. If I let you go, you will report our position. Your forces will come with artillery, air support. My men will be killed or captured. I cannot allow that." "Then let me propose something different," Monroe said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Give us until morning. We will leave at first light, and we will take a route that leads away from your position. We will not report where you are until we reach our lines, which will give you at least 6 hours to move your forces elsewhere. By the time our artillery could target this village, you will be gone." "Why would you do this?" Weber asked suspiciously. "Why would you help us escape?" Monroe looked at the German officer directly. "Because I am a medic. My job is to save lives, not take them. And because I believe that God brought me to this mountain today for this exact purpose, to prevent 12 good men, and however many of your soldiers from dying in a battle that does not matter. The war is over, Captain Weber. You know it. I know it. Let us all choose to survive it." Captain Weber stood silent, clearly struggling with the decision. Behind Monroe, down in the village, the American patrol was watching this exchange with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The vehicles from the valley had reached the outskirts of the village, and German soldiers were dismounting, surrounding the American position more completely. Finally, Weber spoke. "Medic, what is your name?" "Private First Class Isaiah Monroe, sir." "Private Monroe, you are either very brave or very foolish, probably both." Weber glanced back at his men, then at the village where the American patrol was trapped. "I will consider your proposal, but first you will come with me. You will see our full strength so you understand that resistance would be suicide. Then I will give you my answer." Monroe nodded and followed Weber up the slope. They climbed to where the main German position was dug in, a network of foxholes and machine gun nests overlooking the entire valley. And there, Monroe saw something that made his blood run cold. The German force was much larger than he had imagined. There were at least 50 soldiers that he could see, possibly more. They had 4 machine guns positioned to cover every approach to the village, and the vehicles that had come up from the valley included 2 small artillery pieces, guns that could reduce the village to rubble in minutes. "You see now," Weber said, "your men have no chance. If they fight, they die, all of them." "I see," Monroe said quietly, "and I see something else too. I see that you are a good officer who does not want to waste the lives of his men on a pointless battle any more than I want to see mine die. These men have followed you through years of war, Captain. Do not ask them to commit murder in the last days of it." Weber looked at Monroe with an expression that was hard to read. Anger, respect, resignation. Finally, he said, "You have great faith in your God, Private Monroe. I wonder if he truly protects you or if you are simply lucky." "Perhaps both," Monroe said. "But either way, here we are, 2 men trying to find a way to let everyone go home alive. Will you accept my proposal?" For a long moment, Captain Weber did not respond. Then he called out orders in German to his men. Several soldiers moved to collect something from the German position. When they returned, they were carrying the patrol's radio operator, Private Samuel Davis, who had been captured when he had moved too far from the village trying to get a clear radio signal. "Your man is unharmed," Weber said. "You see, we are not the monsters your propaganda describes. We are soldiers, like you." He turned to Monroe directly. "I will accept your proposal, but with conditions. You will remain here as a guarantee. If your men try to attack or if they report our position before morning, you will be shot. Your sergeant must agree to this." "I will stay," Monroe said immediately. "Let me go down and explain to my sergeant." Weber nodded and assigned 2 soldiers to escort Monroe back to the village. The American patrol saw their medic returning under guard and immediately feared the worst. But Monroe's expression was calm, almost peaceful. "Sergeant Colbert," Monroe called out, "I need to speak with you." Colbert approached carefully, his eyes on the German guards. "Monroe, what is happening?" Monroe explained the proposal quickly: safe passage for the patrol in exchange for delayed reporting, and Monroe remaining as a hostage until morning. As he spoke, he could see the conflict in Colbert's face. No sergeant wanted to leave one of his men behind, especially not an unarmed medic with German forces, who might execute him the moment the patrol was gone. "I cannot accept this," Colbert said firmly. "We do not leave our people behind." "You are not leaving me behind," Monroe said. "I am staying by choice, and I will be fine, Sergeant. I have my Bible, and I have my faith. God will protect me." "Monroe—" "Sergeant, listen to me," Monroe said urgently. "If you do not accept this, we all die. Right now. They have artillery up there. They have enough firepower to wipe us out in minutes. This is the only way everyone survives. Trust me. Trust God." The patrol members had gathered close enough to hear this exchange. Thomas Wright spoke up, his voice steadier than it had been all day. "He is right, Sergeant. If Monroe is willing to do this, we should let him." Billy Hayes nodded agreement. "Monroe has more courage than all of us combined. If he says this will work, I believe him." Sergeant Colbert looked at each of his men, then back at Isaiah Monroe. Finally, he said, "All right, we will do it your way. But, Monroe, if you are not back at our lines by tomorrow evening, I am coming to get you myself, with the entire division if I have to." Monroe smiled. "I will be there, Sergeant. I promise." The American patrol was escorted to the southern edge of the village by German soldiers. Captain Weber himself came down to oversee the departure. He spoke to Sergeant Colbert through Monroe, who translated. "Your men will move south," Weber said. "They will not use radios until they are at least 8 kilometers from this position. They will not report what they have seen here until they reach your lines. If they violate these terms, your medic dies. Do you agree?" "I agree," Colbert said, though every word clearly pained him. "Good. Your medic will be treated as a prisoner of war, according to the Geneva Convention. He will not be harmed. You have my word as an officer." The American patrol departed as darkness fell completely over the mountains. Each man looked back at Isaiah Monroe as they left, seeing him standing calmly beside the German captain, his Bible still clutched in his hand. For most of them, it felt wrong to be leaving him behind. But Monroe had insisted, and his absolute conviction that this was the right choice had been impossible to argue against. Isaiah Monroe spent that night among German soldiers who were supposed to be his enemies. Captain Weber assigned him to sleep in one of the village buildings, with 2 guards posted outside. The guards were young men, probably no older than 20, who spoke limited English, but were curious about the American medic who had walked unarmed into their position. One of them, who introduced himself as Hans, asked to see Monroe's Bible. Monroe handed it over, and Hans paged through it carefully, recognizing the text even though he could not read English. "My family has Bible like this," Hans said haltingly, "in Leipzig. My mother reads every night." "Do you read it?" Monroe asked. Hans shrugged. "Before war, yes. Now I do not know. Hard to believe in God when you see what we see." "I understand," Monroe said. "But that is when faith matters most. When everything is darkness, that is when you need to believe there is light." Hans looked at Monroe with an expression of deep sadness. "You are a good man. I hope you live through this war." "You too, Hans," Monroe said. "You too." That night, Isaiah Monroe slept more peacefully than he had in months. He was a prisoner in enemy hands, surrounded by men who could kill him at any moment, in the middle of a war zone with no weapon to defend himself. But he felt no fear. He had done what he believed God wanted him to do. He had saved 12 lives, and probably dozens more German lives by preventing a battle. Whatever happened next, he had fulfilled his purpose. He woke before dawn to find Captain Weber standing in the doorway. "It is time," the German officer said. "Your men are gone. We will be leaving soon, but first I have something to tell you. Something." They walked together through the village as German soldiers dismantled their positions and loaded equipment onto vehicles. Weber spoke quietly as they walked. "Last night, I received orders by radio from division headquarters. The war is over for us, Private Monroe. Germany is negotiating surrender. Our generals have ordered all units to avoid unnecessary combat and prepare for capitulation. If you had not come to talk to me yesterday, if we had fought that battle, my men and yours would have died for nothing, literally nothing." Monroe felt tears welling in his eyes. "God knew," he whispered. "He knew that battle did not need to happen." Weber looked at Monroe with something approaching awe. "Perhaps your God does protect you, medic. You said this was why you were brought to this mountain. Perhaps you were right." The German captain led Monroe to the edge of the village, where the trail led south toward the American lines. "Go," Weber said. "Tell your superiors that the German forces in this sector are withdrawing and will not resist the Allied advance. Tell them that the war is ending. And tell them that today, faith prevented a battle." "Captain Weber," Monroe said, extending his hand, "thank you for choosing mercy." Weber shook Monroe's hand firmly. "Thank you, Private Monroe, for reminding me that we are all human beings, not just soldiers. Perhaps when this is over, we can both go home and try to forget what we have seen." Isaiah Monroe walked south through the mountains as the sun rose over the Apennines. He walked alone, but felt anything but lonely. He sang hymns as he walked, his voice echoing off the rocky slopes. He read passages from his Bible during rest breaks, and he prayed, prayers of thanksgiving, prayers for the men of his patrol who had made it safely back, prayers even for Captain Weber and the German soldiers who had chosen to let him live. He reached American lines just before noon. The sentries were shocked to see him walking down the trail alone, and they immediately called for Sergeant Colbert. When Colbert arrived and saw Monroe alive and unhurt, the normally stoic sergeant embraced him without hesitation. "You scared the life out of me." "Monroe," Colbert said, "I thought I sent you to your death." "No, Sergeant," Monroe replied. "You gave me the chance to do what I was meant to do, and everyone lived because of it." The patrol's story spread quickly through the 92nd Division. Within days, every soldier in the unit knew about the medic, who had walked unarmed into an enemy position and negotiated safe passage for his entire squad. Some called it divine intervention. Others called it incredible luck. But everyone agreed that Isaiah Monroe had displayed courage far beyond what anyone expected from a conscientious objector who refused to carry a rifle. What they did not know, what Monroe himself did not fully understand until years later, was how close they had all come to death. Intelligence reports recovered after the German surrender revealed that Captain Weber's unit had been part of a larger force that was preparing to make a final stand in the northern Apennines. The orders Weber received that night, The orders informing him of Germany's imminent surrender had only reached him because of communication delays. If Monroe had not negotiated that delay, if the battle had happened even 6 hours earlier, both sides would have fought to the death in a battle that the German High Command had already decided was pointless. On May 2, 1945, German forces in Italy officially surrendered. The war in Europe ended 6 days later. Isaiah Monroe survived the war without ever firing a weapon, without ever compromising his faith. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor for his actions in that Italian village, though he always insisted that God deserved the credit, not him. After the war, Monroe returned to Georgia. He became a pastor, like his father before him. He married his childhood sweetheart, raised 4 children, and spent 50 years preaching the gospel of peace and reconciliation. He kept his father's Bible with him always, the same Bible he had carried through the war, and he often told the story of that day in the Italian mountains when faith prevented a battle. Many members of that patrol stayed in contact with Monroe throughout their lives. Thomas Wright, the young soldier who had been so frightened in the village, credited Monroe with saving not just his physical life, but his mental health. Wright said that seeing Monroe's absolute conviction in the face of death had given him something to hold on to during the darkest moments of the war and the years that followed. Sergeant James Colbert, in a letter written to Monroe 20 years after the war, reflected on the lesson of that day. "I was a soldier who believed in guns and tactics and firepower. You taught me that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a weapon at all. It is faith and courage, and the willingness to risk everything for what you believe is right. You saved our lives that day, Monroe, but you did more than that. You showed us a different kind of strength." Perhaps the most remarkable postscript to the story came in 1972, when Isaiah Monroe received a letter from Germany. It was from a man named Hans Weber, the son of Captain Weber. Hans explained that his father had passed away the previous year, but before his death, he had told his family about the American medic who had walked unarmed into his position and convinced him to choose mercy over battle. Captain Weber, according to his son, had been haunted by the war for the rest of his life. He had seen terrible things, done things he regretted, but he told his family that meeting Private Monroe had restored something in him, had reminded him that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual human beings could still choose compassion, could still choose life over death. "My father wanted you to know," Hans Weber wrote, "that he never forgot you. He said you were the bravest man he met during the entire war because you had the courage to believe in something bigger than the war itself. He said you saved not just the lives of your men, but the souls of his men as well. They did not have to commit murder that day, and that saved them from carrying one more terrible act into whatever life they had after the war." Isaiah Monroe kept that letter with his Bible, and in his final years, he would read it to his grandchildren. He wanted them to understand that faith was not passive, that believing in God's protection did not mean avoiding action. It meant having the courage to act according to your beliefs, even when, especially when, doing so required you to risk everything. The story of the medic who carried a Bible instead of a rifle, who walked unarmed into enemy positions, who chose faith over fear, became part of the oral history of the 92nd Infantry Division. It was a reminder that heroism came in many forms, that sometimes the greatest courage was not in fighting but in refusing to fight, in believing that there was a better way even when every circumstance suggested otherwise. In the years after the war, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Monroe became involved in the struggle for racial equality. He marched in protests, organized voter registration drives, and preached sermons about justice and dignity. When people asked how he found the courage to face police dogs and fire hoses, he would tell them about Italy, about walking up a mountain toward armed enemy soldiers with nothing but a Bible and a white flag. "If I could trust God to protect me in a war," but he would say, "then I could trust him to protect me in the fight for freedom. Fear only has power if you let it. And I decided a long time ago that I would not let fear make my decisions for me." Isaiah Monroe passed away in 1998 at the age of 76. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, parishioners, and several elderly men who had served with him in Italy more than 50 years earlier. They told stories about Monroe's courage, his faith, his absolute conviction that love was stronger than hate, that peace was stronger than violence. At the funeral, one of Monroe's granddaughters found his old medical satchel, the one he had carried during the war. Inside was his father's Bible, still worn and soft from decades of handling. And tucked into the pages of the Bible was a pressed flower, a wildflower from the Italian mountains, picked on that day in 1945, when faith prevented a battle and 12 men lived to go home to their families. The legacy of Isaiah Monroe's choice, to carry a Bible instead of a rifle, to trust in God rather than in weapons, echoed far beyond that one patrol, beyond that one day. It became a reminder that even in the midst of humanity's darkest impulses, individual human beings could still choose differently. They could still choose mercy. They could still choose life. The men of that patrol never forgot what Monroe did for them. They told their children and grandchildren about the medic who walked into enemy fire with nothing but faith to protect him. They told about how his absolute conviction in God's protection had given them hope when hope seemed impossible. And they told about how his courage to act on his beliefs had saved not just their lives, but had prevented dozens of German soldiers from having to commit one more act of violence in a war that was already ending. In the end, Isaiah Monroe's story became a testament to a simple but profound truth, that the most powerful force in human experience is not the force that destroys, but the force that preserves. That sometimes the greatest strength is shown not in fighting, but in choosing not to fight. That faith is not passive acceptance of fate, but active trust in something greater than ourselves. The Bible that Isaiah Monroe carried through the mountains of Italy, the Bible that had belonged to his father and his father before him, remained in his family for generations. Written inside the front cover, beneath his father's inscription, Monroe had added his own words in careful script. April 27, 1945. Today God taught me that faith is not believing He will keep you safe from the battle. Faith is knowing that, even if you walk into the battle, He walks with you. And sometimes, that is all the protection you need. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.